Good evening, everyone. Hello. On behalf of the research team, I signed the city of Petersburg, city council members, school board representatives, and other elected officials and community leaders for attending our research presentation that describes the historical and modern-day impact of structural racism on the lives of Black people in the city of Petersburg. This research acknowledges stated trends that contribute to current state inequities and can be used as a catalyst for change to create a more equitable and inclusive city for all residents of the city of St. Petersburg. The city of St. Petersburg commissioned this study. It is a collaborative venture between representatives from the University of South Florida, the African American Heritage Association, United Determinants, One Community, and Urban Marketing Analytics. We embrace our intersectionality of university and community scholars and community advocates in reviewing the relevant literature, examining the data, and making recommendations that can promote racial equity within St. Petersburg. Thus, I would thank my research team for their contribution. Sorry. Next slide, please. My name is Dr. Ruth Mayfield, and I'm an associate professor for mathematics education and the associate director for the Coalition of Science Literacy, with a focus on inclusive excellence. I currently serve as the principal investigator of this study. At this time, I invite my team members to introduce themselves in the following order. So we're just going to pass the mic in the extra some time.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Tim Dutton. I'm a senior consultant with the Foundation for Health and Safety, and been involved with Untitled for the past 4 years. And the focus of Untitled is race equity, and we published the equity profile for the Pinellas County.
Good evening, I'm Gypsy Gallardo. I'm CEO of One Community and the 2020 Plan, and I also am publisher of the Power Broker magazine and prolific in research in this community for the past 25 years.
I'm James McHale. I direct the Family Studies Center on the St. Petersburg's campus, and we also in the Family Center that provides direct services here in the community. I know many of you collaborated for over years. We just wrapped up a project with veteran diseases and collaboration with next step called Figuring Out Things.
Hello, how everybody doing? My name is Steve.
My name is Tom Reich. I'm Professor of Information Systems at the Moment of Business Use at St. Petersburg campus, while I also run the Institute for Data Analytics and Social Justice, where we use techniques to find and analyze data and they relate to issues around social justice, whether it's structural racism, infant violence.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Senda Akiwumi. I'm a professor of geosciences at the University of South Florida Tampa campus, and I'm also the director of the Institute on Black Life. And the mission of the Institute is to serve as a resource center on the history and culture of the Black experience in the African diaspora and on the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So at this time, I invite Mayor Rick Priceman and Deputy Mayor Dr. Kanika Tomlin to bring greetings and provide the catalyst for the study.
get as many people as I can covered here. First off, I want to say a bunch of thank yous to the city staff, to the research team, city council, to all of our partners. I want to say thank you. The work that is being done here is important. It's necessary. Quite frankly, it's long overdue. And so I appreciate everyone's dedication to this project. I also think it's important that we I use this time to set the table for why this study was important. And I'm going to start by saying our vision statement again, because we have really tried to start everything with this vision statement of being a city of opportunity where the sun shines on all who come to live, work, and play. We will be an innovative, creative, and competitive community that honors our past as we pursue our future. You've heard me talk about our vision statement before. I always separated it into two parts. And the first part is about opportunity. And so this study, to me, is really important because it's going to talk about the opportunities that weren't there in the past and how, if we do things right, we can create opportunities going forward. And that's where the second part of the statement comes into play, about honoring our past as we pursue our future. If we don't know our past, how do we move forward? How do we recognize what we didn't do right and make sure we don't do it again? And it's critically important that when you're looking at your past, you're honest about it. And unfortunately, we don't have a history of that in this city or this country for that matter. We like to talk about our past, but we only like to talk about parts of our past. And from what I've seen already, this is all about all of our past, not just the parts that feel good or sound good or make some of us at least feel good or feel good, but about everything. And that's important. And so this vision statement, which is what we've tried to use to guide us in everything we're doing, it's aspirational, and it is who we really want to be as a community. But for a large segment of our community, that means acknowledging, again, the unfortunate truth that disadvantage was and is, in some cases, remains a systemized outcome for African Americans in St. Petersburg. It's the truth. It's what it is. Opportunity cannot be realized in our city without looking back and documenting our full story, not just part of the story, but the full story, as it has unfolded for all of our residents, not just those who live north of Central Avenue. We know there have been unacceptable policies, practices, decisions, abuses of power that have led to unequal treatment and inequitable outcomes for Black residents. That's why we're here. That's why the study was commissioned. We have to be intentional about the actions that we take going forward. If we're not intentional, we're not going to get anything done. Things are going to continue to be the same as they've always been. And these transgressions of the past cannot continue to occur going forward. Our city must promise to equally provide and protect not only people of color in our community, but everyone. And that's opportunity for all. That's why that language was so important in the vision statement. And it is a special time in St. Petersburg. Discussions like this, you think back, it never happened. I'm certainly not aware of it never happened before. But I think we're at a point in time in this city, at least, I wish we were there in our country, but at least in this city, where it's time for honest conversations, an open dialogue, real conversations. Because if we're going to be about diversity and tolerance, and we're going to talk about it, we have to live it and do more than simply talk about it. And then bring that value to our community. I'm proud of the strides we've made and the policies and practices that have changed. But we've got a lot of work to do, and the key is to make it sustainable, that it's lasting. It's not one of these things where we talk about something, we make a change, and 3 years later, we're right back in the same place. We can't go there. That's not who we want to be. And I think this study lays bare our history of systemic racism here, our history of it in our community, across all systems and sectors, but also the pathways to reconciliation again. So I think as a community, we've got to take these steps together. It has to be all of us. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And if we do that, then we truly will become a city of opportunity where the sun shines on all who come in. So thank you all for your testimony.
Thank you, Mayor. Next slide, please. Thank you. The city of St. Petersburg is to be commended publicly for its progressive initiatives to foster racial equity and enhance the overall quality of life for marginalized identities. Notably, to address racial equity, the city has commissioned this study, which we will discuss this evening. It also funded the Disparities study, passed a resolution that racism is a public health crisis, included several proposed amendments to the Charter Review Commission report that are race equity oriented, invested in the 2020 plan, the One Community plan, and the Grow Smarter to close economic gaps, and to create Florida's first standing citywide CBA policy. That is commendable. The City of St. Petersburg effort speaks to an authentic commitment to identify and remove barriers that can create glass ceilings or limit the likelihood that everyone has equitable opportunities to succeed. So to structure this presentation, we will review the purpose of the study, operational definitions, and relevant literature. We will subsequently describe our methods, findings, implication, and future research that is needed. Time at the end will be allocated for questions and answers with the audience. The purpose of this commission study is to provide a historical overview and current data trends that illustrate how structural racism affects aspects of Black lives and community in the city of St. Petersburg, to provide recommendations for policies and practices that may help to dismantle structural racism in the city, and to identify additional facets of structural racism impacting the Black residents and communities in the St. Petersburg area that needs further research, documentation, and funding. Our study focuses on structural racism and its impact, which often impacts one's health. Therefore, we provide the operational definition to center our discourse. According to the Aspen Institute, which is a research entity and think tank, structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequities. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political system in which we all exist. Thus, structural racism is enforced by laws and systems and can contribute to an individual's overall health and well-being. So in discussing structural racism, we must consider the social determinant of health. According to Healthy People 2020, the social determinant of health are conditions in the environment in which people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age that affect a wide range of health, functioning, and quality of life, outcome, and risk. Hence, your health can be influenced by personal living and working conditions in homes and communities, and economic and social resources and opportunities that an individual can access. The review of relevant literature suggests that racial disparities exist in the criminal, legal, economic, health, and educational system. Notably, data trends indicate that Black people have a higher incarceration rate than their white counterparts. It also suggests that white Americans are more likely to own houses and benefit from economic opportunities. The data also indicate that schools with primarily Black students continue to struggle with providing adequate resources, having qualified teachers, and ensuring students demonstrate proficiency on assessment with the state and national level, which reaffirmed the stance of the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka case that argued separate and segregated school environment does not result in equal educational opportunities. Additionally, researchers found that Blacks often have disproportionately higher morbidity and mortality rates and unequal access to medical care. Thus, considering St. Petersburg is a microcosm within Florida and the continental United States, which have a history of Jim Crow laws that negatively impacted Blacks, it was hypothesized that the results of our study would align with previous findings. Nevertheless, our study is novel because it considers the historical artifacts, current data sets, and the voices of the community members to conceptualize the impact of structural racism trends within the city of St. Petersburg, and it provides recommendations to dismantle structural racism. Thus, we sought to magnify the voices and experiences of residents within this community and offer recommendations that can better meet the residents' needs. This study sought to answer the following research question: what is the historical and modern day impact of structural racism on the lives of Black people in the city of St. Petersburg, Florida? To answer the research question, data were garnered from the City of St. Petersburg report, articles in newspaper and journals, city council meeting minutes, property records, community-based organizational records, US Census data, the Americans Community Survey, the Survey of Business Owners, and the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurship, and most importantly, the personal narrative from residents. The qualitative data were analyzed using a historical analysis of historical documents, and thematic analysis of interviews and focus groups occurred, while the quantitative data were analyzed using frequency percentages and measures of central tendencies. The narrative I share this evening and the slide content are drawn in part verbatim from the reports that will be released shortly. The results suggest that pro-slavery individuals were active in the social and civic landscape and contributed to drafting bills that oppressed Blacks. Jim Crow laws limited resources and facilities Blacks could access and restricted opportunities for social interactions between races that could have contributed to economic and educational opportunities. Thus, the presence of segregated ideologies created barriers for Blacks to obtain the same opportunities that were afforded to their white counterparts. The practice of lynching and the visible presence of the Ku Klux Klan that worked in conjunction with the police terrorized the Black community. Wild car chases, brutal beatings, and hanging were reported. Black men were sent for the slightest offense to the stockade located near the gas plant area on 3rd Avenue. Moreover, vagrancy laws and racial sentencing disparities were used to fuel convict labor programs. These practices contributed to the criminalization and demonization of Blackness. Historically, arrests by St. Petersburg police, and in some cases Pinellas County deputies, served as a central intake point that fed Black labor program. Once convicted into at least 3 major work outlets. 1, under city jail labor programs, thousands of Black inmates were put to work on city weed gangs, sanitation, sewer, and other public work contracts. City-funded construction projects were being done by private sector contractors, mention of vagrancy pipelines to feed the seawall. County level and state prison work programs, including road construction, chain gangs, and prisons. The racial disparity observed in the criminal legal system during the early 1900s is still evident today. We found that racial disparities were evident in arrest and conviction records. For example, from 1910 to 1935, African Americans were about 18% of the city population during that era. However, Black people, men and women, accounted for 76% of persons sentenced to time behind bars and 82% of those convicted to hard labor. While the data for 2020 and the first 3 months of 2021 highlighted that except for reckless and careless driving of a motor vehicle and noise, the percentage of Black defendants for each offense exceed the percentage of Black population in the St. Petersburg area. Prior to the civil rights era, Blacks were not elected to the public office in the city of St. Petersburg. Thus, Black voices in policy making were limited. The lack of Black representation on the city council, the judiciary, and school board, and the enforcement of policies that restricted Black voting rights limited Black ability to generate and vote on policies that disrupted discriminatory practices. Thus, inequities lay at the intersections of Black silence and absence in the city of St. Petersburg politics and public offices. Furthermore, we found multiple city officials, including elected mayors and council members, who expressed bold stances to support economic and residential segregation, even if it meant disobeying or circumventing national law. Hence, the bias and belief of its elected officials impacted the policies that were enforced and the normalized practices that contributed to the disenfranchisement of the Black community. The pace of infrastructure development quickened after the completion of the Orange Belt Railroad in 1889 and the incorporation of the city of St. Petersburg in 1892. Over the 80 years that followed, the construction of the lighthouse through 1930, public coffers expanded over $1 billion to develop amenities, infrastructures, and institutions to the exclusive use of the city's white residents. Taxpayers funded or subsidized the construction of transportation routes, a picturesque downtown waterfront, segregated educational institutions such as St. Pete High School and St. Pete Junior College, white-only parks, beaches and recreational facilities, commercial infrastructure to pave the way for white businessmen to prosper, and healthcare and other emphasis that African Americans could enter only when working, if at all. The one exception was the local jail, the first of which was built on the authority of the inaugural town council shortly after being formed in 1892. Its cells were open to receive African American prisoners and arrestees since the inception of local law enforcement practices in St. Petersburg. Thus, the only thing that was built for Blacks was a jail. Hence, racial disparities in public investment and economic development, public amenities, and infrastructure continued well into the latter half of the 20th century, which had a profound impact in stunting the economic growth of African Americans within St. Petersburg. The impact of economic segregation stagnated financial opportunities for Black residents. It imposed market limits for Black entrepreneurs and city-sanctioned contracts limitations. Furthermore, wage fixing, convict labor loans, leasing programs, and racial inequities in compensation for work reduced the likelihood that Blacks would have similar financial and housing opportunities as their white counterparts. Moreover, displacement impacted 12 times more Black-led families, organizations, and businesses. In the pre-city era, white entrepreneurs who settled the territory benefited from government investments such as land grants beginning in 1842. Once the city was established, segregation policies applied to entrepreneurship as thoroughly as they did to neighborhood boundaries. African Americans were excluded from opportunities under control of or controlling influence of city officials for decades before intentional strategies first began to take shape. Segregation inevitably caps the growth potential of Black entrepreneurs, relegating them to only an estimated 4% share of consumer spending. In St. Petersburg in 1920, and roughly 0.5% of businesses to business spending. This market share grew over time, but only marginally. In 1969, African Americans produced only 7.4% of aggregate family income in the city. The analysis revealed that between 2006 to 2008, the median annual income for Blacks were always lower than their white counterparts. In 2006, the median annual earned income of people who identified as Black and Pinellas was 67% of those who identified as white. By 2018, that ratio was 73%. Our data analyzed revealed that racial disparity persists in median annual income regardless of educational level attainment. The median income differences persist even if education levels are normalized. The only field in which median annual earned income for Blacks exceed white is educational administration and teaching. So we see that in census tract, with a high percentage of African Americans, the value range from 1.5% to 95.1%. Both the assessed value and the sale price per square foot are among the lowest in St. Petersburg. Moreover, the percentage of sales of residential properties in which the sale price is less than the assessed value also tend to be higher in African American census tract, suggesting that property buyers assign a lower value to properties in African American communities. However, there is a caveat that there are very few sales in predominantly Black census tract environments. Educational disparities reveal that segregated school environments do not result in equal opportunities for Black students. Historical analysis revealed that funding for primarily Black schools was inadequate and the amount of time in school was less for Blacks than white. Despite the federal mandate to desegregate schools, Pinellas County built new schools that would later be abandoned to avoid Black spillovers into nearby white schools. This strategy was used for 15 years as an effective dodge to the Supreme Court 1954 order. A system of pairing and clustering Black and white schools was used in the late 1960s to start desegregation in 9 predominantly Black schools. In September 1971, the Pinellas County School Board voluntarily desegregated countywide by ways of court-ordered busing. Pinellas is among the last county in the state to desegregate their schools, but it was the first county to use busing to accomplish desegregation. Pinellas County engaged in the 50-year lawsuit regarding educational disparities pertaining to graduation rates, proficiency on state assessments, participating in accelerated classes, school disciplines, eligibility criteria for special education programs, and increasing staff diversity. The case was sent to mediation in 2016 after the court ruled the system was not unitary and ordered the county to address it. Thus, the Bridging the Gap plan was proposed. Hence, the fight for racial equity in education persists. Historically, Black access and quality of care were not on par with what was offered to their white counterparts. For instance, public hospital access was available elsewhere in Pinellas in 1906, but was not available to the South St. Petersburg Black community until 1923, when the racially segregated Mercy Hospital opened. Historically, due to inadequate funding, inadequate staffing, and delays in revolutionary technologies, Black care was never on par with white patients in the city. Black struggles with health disparities from birth and have a lower life expectancy than their peers in counties with a history of lynching. In Pinellas County, where the infant mortality rate 6.8 per 1,000 live birth is higher than the state rate of 6.1, the rate at which Black infants die during their first year of life, 12.9%, is more than double that for white infants, which is 5.3%. According to the Foundation for a Healthy St. Petersburg 2018 report, except for lung cancer, the Black or African American rate exceeds the rate of both white and Hispanic for all leading causes of death, including diabetes, heart failure, stroke, and coronary heart disease. Based on our study, we propose the following 4 recommendations. Recommendation 1, to create an equity department in the office of the mayor. The director of the office will have a permanent seat at each successive administrative table for all meaningful decisions and outcomes. The role of the director would include an annual equity assessment with input from the community, liaising with the budget committee to negotiate adequate funds for needed city projects, and staying on top of data to bring important issues to the notice of the city and its residents in a timely fashion. This recommendation is consistent with the newly proposed amendments to the city charter, specifically proposed amendment number 3. Recommendation number 2, create and implement an effective accountability strategy with measurable outcomes that are tracked over time with disaggregated data, allowing the city to monitor and incrementally improve progress and performance until equitable outcomes are achieved. This should include a commitment to a race equity review of existing policies and practices and of all future proposed policies and practices. Recommendation number 3, create a permanent resident race equity board or commission to help ensure the sustainability of the recommended transformation, inform and drive continual progress. It is recommended that it becomes a permanent way of conducting businesses in the city. Finally, recommendation number 4. Based on the explicit request from members of the St. Pete community, it is recommended that the city systemically and systematically examine and initiate steps towards providing reparations. There are numerous avenues for pursuit of reparation, and St. Petersburg might examine relevant precedents taking root in other communities. These include accessible and affordable housing policies, including initiatives enacted in Evanston, Illinois, and proposed in Asheville, North Carolina. A relevant race equity commission established in Iowa City in 2001 might also provide useful insight for initial guidance. There is a pressing and acute need that might be considered for discussion regarding restitution related to redevelopment of the 86 acres once home of the gas plant district, which is now the Tropicana Fields location. Sustaining a focus on such concerns will help build a racially just and equitable future by taking concrete actions to address the enduring legacy of white supremacy. We acknowledge that this work is viewed as phase 1 and was restricted to a 6-month timeline. Hence, more work needs to be done with appropriate funding to ensure that the various systems are carefully examined to identify and address disparities. Funding is needed to ensure sufficient staff can be employed and appropriate resources can be acquired to address the following topics and implement solutions identified by previous research studies. Thus, we recommend the adoption of action-based research and the funding to examine the effectiveness of various proposed interventions. Education. There is a need to examine root causes and solutions used to address educational disparities between Black and white children, equitable allocation of funding appropriation, student-to-teacher ratio, difference in teacher qualification and retention within the county, and document those trends over time. Health. There is a need to examine root causes and the intersection of risk factors affecting one's health. Criminal legal. There is a need to examine differences between Black and white residents' arrests, probation, sentencing, and plea deal within the criminal legal system. Consideration ought to be given to the circumstances as to which individuals accept plea deals. Housing and home ownership. There is a need to examine historical trends of home ownership and financial assistance offered to racial and ethnic groups. Community-based research. We acknowledge culture is fluid and it can change over time. Therefore, there is a need to engage in community-based research to describe the lived experiences of residents in the city and to amplify their voices relative to the challenges and opportunities afforded to them. This can provide insight into the impact of interventions employed to dismantle structural racism and promoting racial equity. Finally, hiring practices. We need to examine private and corporate business hiring trends and pay equity. So at this time, I invite my colleagues to discuss the implication of the research relative to implementing the regional and national initiatives to dismantle structural racism, revising the economic systems to increase financial opportunities for all residents, reviewing the criminal legal system for potential bias, the need to reimagine the pathway to examine pathways to support educational attainment in pre-K through 20 environments, promoting racially just, trauma-informed, and family-centered practices in all systems serving Black residents to better residents' health outcomes. I also like to acknowledge the contribution of Ms. Gwendolyn Reese, who's not able to join us, but her voice has definitely been valued and she's an active participant to this research team. So at this time, Mrs. Gypsy Gallardo will fill in for Ms. Gwen, who's not able to join us.
All right, hello. So if anyone who saw me writing feverishly, it was because I learned just prior to this session that I would stand in for my mentor, Gwendolyn Reese, in conveying implications of this work. With awareness comes impetus and opportunity and responsibility to act. The city of St. Petersburg and other local government leaders have indeed begun to look back at past disparities. They have begun to saddle up to discussion tables to hash out new and innovative solutions. Those discussions are not easy. They involve truths and different perspectives that can lead to heated conversations, hurt feelings, stalemates in negotiations, and sometimes deep disappointment that progress remains too slow and often too incremental. And yet, St. Petersburg officials time and again have leaned into that uncomfortable space. Just last week, city administration and our city council approved what stands to be the largest economic equity project in St. Petersburg history, the project known as Deuces Rising and Sankofa on the Deuces. Yet too often in decades past and even in the present, actions that have moved African Americans forward in the city have required sustained mass action by Black advocates and white allies, local and federal lawsuits, some of which unfolded over years and at great financial and emotional cost to those involved. I believe and I know that my mentor, Gwendolyn Reese, for whom I speak this evening, shares the opinion that we here in St. Pete stand on the verge of a breakthrough, one that permanently cements a data-driven approach to developing solutions to race equity that, in the words of Deputy Mayor Dr. Kanika Tomlin, permanently changed the life trajectory of young people who today call St. Petersburg home, and in so doing, put our city on path to be a city where the sun shines on African Americans as brightly as it does on our white neighbors. Thank you. And my colleague Jabbar Edmond will speak next.
Thank you very much. I think the importance of these implications are policies and practices. If we look through the history, what I learned is that even when the laws change, policies and practices remain the same. And some policies and practices still remain the same to this day, because the evidence shows that we live almost in a state of emergency in South St. Pete. The Black community, whether it's AIDS, whether it's diabetes, whether it's cancer, you name the disease, we are suffering from it tremendously. And the problem is, there is no policy being written to fix it or address it. We are not addressing it as it's a state of emergency. We're addressing it as it's everyday and it's normal, because it is. This is the way it's been. The evidence shows. But if we have a commitment to make a change, it has to start with policies and practices. We can do a lot for our community, because I'm going to tell you, if you ride down this road towards the south side, it's dying. While the rest of the community is growing, you ride south of 22nd and just look, when you leave here today, and just ride south, it is dying, literally, not just economically, but health, not only just health, mental health, not only mental health, incarceration rates, crime rates, murder rates. I mean, you just roll the whole list out. And South St. Pete is suffering from it. And I don't think the reality is sunk in that it is a state of emergency. I think that everyone continues as it's a regular day because it is normal. This is how the Black community has normally been treated in St. Petersburg. If you look at the food desert map, it's a highlighted map, it's a square map of South St. Pete. And inside of that exact same map is the same health ailments I just mentioned. It's the same heart disease, cancer, it's all the same, what they call the social determinants of health, right? And I learned this from the foundation, right? And as I learned it and continue to learn it, I'm like, how can we continue to be in this posture as if it's a regular day, right? Because if you go to city council and you look, how many policies and practices have been put up to change these health outcomes? If you look, it's on the record. How many policies and practices, how many emails are going around in the city's emails about changing some of these policies and practices? And I'm gonna stop right here, but I really hope that we really take a step, and I mean, we need to take a leap, y'all. We don't need to wait till another administration or another city council. We have to take a leap because people are literally dying because of policies and practices that were put in effect a long time ago.
Oh, it's my turn again. Okay. All right. And I normally speak from the heart. This was a bit important to me. And so I prepared remarks, some of which you already covered, but I did see Dr. Cynthia Johnson walking in the meantime, and Chris Steinecker and some others who may not have heard. So a tiny bit of this is going to be repetitive. And my part is 5 minutes extended by 30 seconds, right? Okay, so for 100 years after the first African-American arrived in the area that became St. Petersburg, the city's white power brokers exerted unmitigated influence over public policy decisions and the allocation of today's equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in public investments for developments that benefited white people exclusively or nearly so. Over much of that span, white private sector interests remained the sole beneficiaries of city-sponsored economic development programs and every other genre of policy under the purview of city officials. In all decisions involving public resources and who would control and benefit from them, officials invariably empowered the Jim Crow racial economic hierarchy. This resulted in decades of public policies, investments, and institutionalized norms, explicitly designed to enrich whites and to limit economic gains for African Americans. Through these instruments, City of St. Pete officials, like many of their peers across the state and nation, perpetuated the white-black economic gaps that existed in the wake of emancipation and that still exist, only partly abated in the present. The disparities are so pervasive and vast as to be beyond the power of this 5-minute statement to provide any more than a glimpse. I will therefore highlight 2 examples found during this study. One Dr. Sears has already touched on was a city-operated convict labor program. The City of St. Petersburg operated a convict work program fueled by Black targeted vagrancy laws and a sweeping system of criminal sentencing disparities that led to the arrest, conviction, and forced labor of thousands of African Americans in St. Petersburg over nearly 60 years. The system also had the effect of suppressing wages paid to Black workers in the private sector. Media reports confirmed the use of Black convict labor on city projects as far back as 1901, but there is every indication that the system predates the 20th century. It was applied most stringently during labor shortages. The targeting of African Americans was crystal clear. Are these up on the, did you get my slides in there? Ruth May? Okay. Perhaps not, so I'll read these quotes. In targeting African American, the targeting of African Americans was crystal clear in the statements of local officials as examples, and I never in real life use the N-word. I may use it because it's in a quoted statement here. In 1912, City Council President J.J. Sullivan, in complaining of leniency toward Black vagrants, said that were certain police officers still on the police force with A.T. Blocker as mayor, the Negroes of the city would work, as these men would not trifle with niggers, and had had remarkable success controlling the Negro population. In 1914, Police Chief A.J. Easters announced a campaign to break up Negro loafing, saying these idle Negroes loaf around the city. We mean to break up these gangs of worthless, no-count Negroes. To document the economic impact, our study analyzed a 25-year period from 1910 to 1935 and found that racially motivated arrest and sentencing disparities by city and other local officials robbed Black families of hundreds of millions of dollars in labor that went into prison work programs instead. Example number 2, city actions to limit Black home ownership and home values. City officials openly colluded with white property owners to limit Black home buying and building in white areas, while simultaneously supporting policies that limited Black-owned home values within segregated Black areas. This study documented 42 years of unlawful, extra-legal, and extraordinary actions by city leaders to block the quote-unquote encroachment of Blacks into white restricted neighborhoods, along with 105 years of hugely disparate investments in amenities and infrastructure, such as street paving and lighting and utility connections that in turn suppressed home values in Black areas. Mayor John Burroughs said in 1958, "I like the Negro. I like him in his place. I do not believe in integration." His policy stances and those of other city officials upheld segregation until the mid-1960s, even in defiance of federal court orders. As one city manager confirmed in 1959, the lack of paved streets in Negro areas prohibited FHA financing to African-American borrowers, Meanwhile, over the prior decade, the city of St. Petersburg had spent in excess of $60 million to pave, beautify, and amenize white restricted areas of the city. Estimating the racial wealth disparity that resulted from these policies is beyond the scope of the study, but without doubt cost the African-American community upwards of $100 million in asset values unrealized. In closing, these are but two examples of the ways in which city officials' actions inhibited income and asset growth for African-American residents of St. Petersburg. Other areas include rampant discrimination in city hiring, promotions and pay to white versus Black workers, official actions to limit Black entrepreneurship, and documented disparities in health and education spending across the two race groups, among other blatant disparities. By the end of the civil rights era, when public officials began the process of creating equal and equitable access to opportunity, the median household income of whites was 1.7 times that of Blacks, 1.7 times that of Blacks. Today in St. Petersburg, the ratio stands at 1.6 times higher income for whites versus Blacks.
Thanks, Gypsy. Earlier today, I talked with an organization that's starting to work on a race history of state policy. And in rural Georgia, I'm familiar with a consortium of counties that's being advised to do the same thing. I say this to say that this approach that the city has chosen to take is significant, it's bold, and I think it's deep in terms of its recognizing the history in a way that can make a difference. And it's already been stated, but I'm going to state it again because it's so important. This city has undertaken a disparity study, has a charter review commission that's centered race equity. It has passed a resolution recently, just in the past couple of months, that declares racism a public health crisis, and it's commissioned this report. I cannot believe that there's another city in the country that's done those things. But it's not just a history project, that's for sure. This is an approach to generate change. And again, several people, including my colleague Jabbar, talked about policy and practice. Well, it's been shown, it's in fact, Aspen Institute identifies that the things that are going to greatly impact or change race equity, improve race equity, are policy, because the inequities have been generated by policies, past and present. They are practice, not what's written down, but how do things actually happen in the moment, in the field, by people who have a power differential. And lastly, and more complicated, it's changing the narrative that we tend to use as a country, a narrative of blame. And that's a hard one, and it's one that we need to take on straight on. So, but those three things give me a hope and sort of a positive outlook, because those three things can be done. Policies can change. The past policies give us guidance for what needs to change, but we need to be paying attention to current policies. I can tell you right now, there are current policies in the state of Florida and undoubtedly in this city and in this county that are generating disparities. I'm working with Senator Rousseau over policies that are state eviction law. There's policies around fees and fines. These things are currently impacting people in a significant way. So in the criminal legal environment, we know that there's bias on the bench, that judicial practices are disproportionately impacting people who are Black. We also know that there's bias in law enforcement in both the city and in the county. We also know, by the way, that the clerk of courts has a very robust database that starts making that information visible in today's terms, not just historically, but in today's terms, we can look and see what those things are if we explore that database. We know that the field of criminal legal, the criminal legal system, is a huge opportunity for making change happen. And it shows up in much of what we've already talked about, the plea bargaining that's been already mentioned. Bail reform. Bail is an antiquated system that is radically disproportionately impacting communities of color, and frankly, needs to be changed very quickly. The fees and fines already mentioned. And then we already talked about judicial bias and law enforcement practices. And at the same time, there are places that we can look as models or guides in charting this course. The Fees and Fines Justice Center, which operates in this state, but also is housed in New York and is doing a lot of work in California. Across the country, prosecuting attorneys are taking on, in bold ways, the things that relate to plea bargaining and others that we mentioned. And the bail reform efforts in many states and many locations are making a big difference. So from an implication standpoint, in the criminal legal system, the optimism is that we can identify where the issues are, and we can change the policies that are currently impacting people. And that gives me hope. But I echo what Jabbar talked about the urgency for this is because it's happening every day today.
I wanted to follow up on some issues regarding housing. And the city is, of course, commended for its efforts to build affordable housing. But it's important to realize that affordability is usually defined in terms of area median income. And we have already seen that the median income for African Americans is significantly lower than it is for white folks. And even within South St. Pete, the median household income in the census tract to the southeast of us is three times less than the median income of the census tract that we're in. So when we're going to define affordability in terms of area median income, let's be very careful what area we're looking at. Second point I wanted to make is about mortgage applications. We started to look at mortgage applications, and we see that at the same debt to income ratio, African Americans are turned down for mortgages at twice the rate than white applicants. And that's the same for loan to value ratios as well. We suspect, we don't know this yet, but we suspect that this is because African Americans tend to have a lower credit rating. And that is partly due to the fact in which credit scores are calculated. For example, paying your rent on time doesn't count, paying your utility bills on time doesn't count, you must have some credit in order to get a credit score. Now, we can't change that, I think, at the national level, but we might be able to work with some local financial organizations to see if we can come up with another way of determining credit scores for folks who don't have credit cards and debit cards.
All right, so I'm speaking towards education, my field of specialty as a STEM professional. So this community is well aware of disparities that have long existed relative to the educational experiences of Black students in St. Petersburg and Pinellas County. The concerned organizations for a quality education of Black students, COQUEBS, thank you, Rick Davis, has been involved in monitoring and advancing the quality of educational experiences of Blacks in Pinellas County, promoting the closing achievement gaps and supporting educational initiatives that promote the overall success of Black students. In partnership with the school system, COQUEBS meet monthly with school systems officials to identify and monitor implementation of emerging best practices for bridging the gap and promoting equity. And the collaboration that has evolved stands as one model for planning strategically, deaggregating data, and relentlessly and continuously monitoring successes and absences of success to transform inequitable systems. Leadership from University of South Florida, St. Petersburg campus has met annually with COQUEBs for nearly a decade to monitor the campus' own performance in supporting Black students' enrollment and retention and creating a campus environment that reflects and serves its community. Partnership between the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and Pinellas schools have evolved over the past decade, and many here have contributed to those efforts. In ongoing and new work, our collective aim must be to reimagine the educational pathway, including the unfinished learning that occurred due to COVID-19. Attention must be given to the ecosystem of learning and to characteristics of the people, technology utilized, the content taught, culture and climate of learning environments, and the impact of in-school and out-of-school learning experiences. We must consider the academic and career pathways afforded students and implications these trajectories have on individual economic opportunities in the future. Continuous attention must be afforded curricula and those factors that possibly impact the educational experiences of Black students, and we must seek to amplify best practices. In so doing, strength-based approaches can be employed to address racial and educational challenges impacting Black students that can guide this work in ways that can detail the efforts of the faculty and staff of USF, including our study team member, Dr. Fender Akawumi. School readiness does not start in kindergarten or even pre-K. It starts from birth. For the past 12 years, COQUEB has partnered with USF Family Study Center and numerous other community partners to spearhead a school readiness committee focused equally on preschool and on the child's first 3 years of life. The Family Study Center has also partnered with residents, community leaders, and partners throughout the city to elevate community voices and to create programs supporting Black fathers and mothers before their children are even born. Finally, newer educational research funded by the University of South Florida includes support for the David C. Anshin Center for the Advancement of Teaching, which has expanded its mission of working with K-12 teachers towards restructuring schools to undertake new work to examine school readiness rates and support early childhood development research. The COQUEB's school system working relationship has been exemplary in establishing accountability metrics to track progress over time. Gaps remain, but progress has been steady. Through strategic planning and design, the Bridging the Gap plan, together with newer studies and initiatives, can contribute to logic models that can be used to promote equitable opportunities across the spectrum of learning from infancy through college and beyond. Strong planning and trustworthy partnership can go a long way. We must collectively reimagine the pathways for Black students in education. Thank you.
So most of you know, and Jabbar made mention of this a little while ago, that for virtually every health condition, from mortality through the average age of death, and essentially everything in between, there are major disparities between Black and white residents. You can see such data through the Florida Department of Health's online health equity index, which lets you compare by race, age, and gender. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation offers a tool allowing examination of life expectancy by zip code. Foundation for Healthy St. Pete has documented gaps over a decade in life expectancy of people living in different areas of St. Pete, such as Campbell Park and Snowline. Economic disparities are a major reason why, but the effects of structural racism that we'll be talking about today reach far beyond socioeconomics. I wanted to focus and we'll talk a little bit about infant mortality rates. For white women, and these are national data, not just here in St. Pete, but for white women with a college education, rates are about 4 deaths per 1,000 fact that Black college-educated mothers have worse birth outcomes than white mothers without a high school education. Data like these demand that we rethink everything, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to be part of this initiative and get us connecting the dots. I just started doing this less than a decade ago myself. Birth outcomes are not just because of the 9 months of pregnancy, but they're because of differential exposures of Black and white women across the lifespan. Racism creates chronic wear and tear on people's bodies, overloads the body's stress response system, hormonal systems, inflammatory functions, metabolic functions. Over time, stress erodes biological systems. The foundations of brain and architecture and biology are built during earliest infancy and the first 3 years of life. You and I are sitting here today with stress response systems that were created in the environments we grew up with. We were infants and toddlers. They were created, that brain development was created in the first 30 to 36 months of our life. We sit here today with those systems that were created. We sit here now with cortexes and the ability to think in ways that we couldn't as infants and toddlers. And so when we get stressed out, we can say to ourselves, it's okay, you can calm down. Infants and toddlers can't do that. The more the stress continues, the more that system gets eroded, the more it gets built into their biology. And then the systems compromised as they first develop it that are carried throughout life can be further damaged by early childhood adversity. You all know about early childhood adversity. We've been talking about ACEs here for a decade. But by the adolescent experiences into adulthood. So trying to repair cumulative damage that's occurred by compressing remedies into the 9-month gestational period during pregnancy is just too little, too late. For about 20 years now, our Family Study Center has been working in this birth to 3 space with St. Pete, Taos County families and partners. We've talked a little bit about our work with Next Step with Helping Start Federal. As I mentioned, our long-term collaboration with COQUIP School Readiness Committee. But we give priority to infants and toddlers because 80 to 85% of our brain development, your brain development, my brain development was completed by the age of 3. And that includes our stress responses completed by the age of 3. We talk about school readiness and we sort of get in there at age 4, age 5 and try to get kids off to a good start. We've ignored the very years of life when our system is being wired in an online fashion by the everyday experiences that we're having. Which is great. If you're living in a pretty copacetic peaceful environment, but if you're living in a high stress environment, and your mom, your dad, and your grandma, and your child care provider are all being beaten down by this cumulative stress that we're talking about, the infants and toddlers by association are being affected in ways that we don't even think about. We used to see babies with bulletproof head exactly backwards. Babies are the most vulnerable in terms of construction of their biological systems. So once this foundation is compromised, then the kinds of racist assaults that we've been talking about weaken a system that was optimally created to begin with. So everything we've been talking about, inadequate job income, no accumulated wealth, no stable place to live, harassment, unjust treatment by the law, all of those intersect to weather and further erode health through the lifespan. So it's no wonder that we're talking about these health disparities, not just mental health, but health disparities, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, you name it. And those diseases are there because it's worn down autoimmune system, and then people die earlier. Things get worse when the systems that we've created to serve people are themselves racially biased. If services available are not competent, they create additional stress. At best, they drive people away from utilizing them, and sometimes they create harm. And there's one example that just really stood out to me as I was reviewing the literature. In the state of Florida, when Black newborns are cared for by Black rather than white physicians, the infant mortality rate is cut in half. Data between 1992 and 2015 show that under the care of white physicians, Black newborns experienced 430 more fatalities per 100,000 births than white newborns. Under the care of Black physicians, rates fell to 173 fatalities per 100,000 of both white newborns. This is a difference of 257 deaths per 100,000 births, 58% reduction in racial mortality difference. Lots of reasons that you can imagine what might be going on with that. One may be that Black physicians may be more aware of and responsive to challenges and issues that arise when treating Black parents. Unfortunately, Black providers at all levels of health and mental health care are insufficient to maximize the support of this. So what do we do? The Foundation for Healthy St. Pete funded us for a few years over our Family Study Center to provide support to several area agencies that serve families with infants and toddlers. I can remember all of them. Operation PAR, Maternal Child Health, Community Health Centers, Family Enrichment Services, a few others as well, Healthy Start Coalition. And
the agencies that we work with, leadership agencies, worked intentionally to strengthen trauma-informed, family-centered practices at their organizations, from front desk personnel through the frontline providers, middle upper management. Over the past year, we introduced consultations to explicitly promote deeper staff understanding of racial trauma and implicit bias. It's important work. It's a drop in the bucket. Wholesale changes are going to be needed across systems to eliminate the everyday indignities that Black adults encounter as they engage with largely white systems of care and support. Last example of this, and I just read this literally last night, example of intersectionality. A brand new study shows that the incarceration of children's fathers is associated with telomere length in kids. Biomarker of chronic stress. Telomere is kind of like, I'm not a biologist, I'm not the right person to teach you this, but it's kind of like your fingernails. It's a longer fingernail, more protection of your cuticles. Telomere length is affected in children by the incarceration of their fathers. Rates of paternal incarceration exponentially higher for Black than white children, differentially affecting Black child health. In a very real way, the criminal justice system is driving and shaping intergenerational racial health disparities. So this is just some of the intersectionality. The changes that we need here in the city are daunting, but we can't put them off. We're talking about that all day. Kids who are currently in utero are going to be new mothers and fathers in our community themselves, just a few city administrations from now. The experiences that they'll have in the city in 2021, 22, 23, they're going to directly shape the biological systems that will then become the platform for their lifetime health and resilience. Small improvements in multiple systems as we pursue overall transformations are also very important. And everyone's got to be part of this change, from the customer service agents at the front door to the decision makers whose actions are going to impact not just the fate of Black adults, but the babies and children.
So these are the references that were cited. And so at this time, we acknowledge the contributions of the scholars ahead. We open the mic and your feedback, the conversation. And our online audience, please make a note in the chat. Marcia, your hand was up, so I'm not certain if that was up all along or is that a new hand?
So you can check that while just a little housekeeping. When you stand up, please make sure you say your name and organization if you like, so we'll have it for the record as a part of what we're recording here. Also, another housekeeping, there is water in the back, of restrooms right out front, and there is still some food at the bottom. So just let me know and I'll bring the mic over to you. Anybody? And definitely questions for the study team.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for this great presentation. My name is Marielle Summers. I'm not with the organization. I guess I'm a candidate for District 6, so that's my organization. But I have a question here, and I wrote it out. I think morale is an anchor that holds us back from faster gains in a lot of these gaps. I see it in the discouraged mindsets of many in our community, from the crime rate to the underutilization of resources that are already available, to other cultural components in our music and entertainment. I think Du Bois alluded to this about 100 years ago in The Souls of Black Folks. So my question for you all is, as we look to implement the actions towards bringing and closing these gaps, how can we address the morale, kind of what Dr. Mikhail was talking about, the mindset of the people in the community who are discouraged and maybe a little, not totally bought into what it is we're talking about.
Do you want to share maybe what Ms. Lynn mentioned as a part of doing this study? I think that also speaks to morale and the challenges around this work.
Okay, so as a longtime advocate in this community, I can tell you that battlefield fatigue is real. I was fortunate to have worked with some of our elders who have since gone home, Verl Davis, Adele Jemison, being two names that come to mind. But in the generation after me, the troops are thin. We don't have a next generation equipped, trained, active in advocacy. And how do we deal with that? I will highlight the debate that Jabbar and I had leading into this study. It was Jabbar's advocacy and the folks who work with him, more probably be one of them in the audience. They advocated for what became probably, we're told by Bloomberg Harvard, the first major city in the United States to commission a structural racism study. To Tim's point earlier, Jabbar became very discouraged, if I may share our story, because it's our story, that this did not take shape in the way that advocates had pushed for. Yet we, through dialogue and through disagreement and those difficult conversations and some mentoring moments, came to the realization that this was infinitely more powerful than what was originally recommended. And Jabbar texted me during the course of these proceedings to say that we both feel that our hopes were realized for this exercise, that this was in fact a very powerful thing. To Marielle's point, advocates, one of the points I made to Jabbar is advocates need to understand that their work is making a difference. How do you get over the morale issue, Marielle and others? We need to go back to those advocates who put their time, energy, angst into the creation of this exercise to help them understand that they were part of something bigger than themselves so that they can be encouraged and will be active in the next frontier.
My name is Beatrice Barrow. I work for the Juicy Side, welcome to the Juicies, the business district on 22nd Street South. So I wanted to follow up to the young people who are advocating. I want to publicly say thank you because you advocated for the CALL program and tremendous success. I've never seen it in a newspaper. I've never seen it in online article, not a lot, but I want to publicly say thank you because now people are being your presentation is so impactful, and I'm curious, do you have plans to share it with other constitutional officers in St. Petersburg, specifically the sheriff, the property appraiser, and the clerk of the circuit court?
Thank you for mentioning that, Gypsy. All of them were invited to, I'm not Gypsy, Beatrice. All of them were invited tonight. And that information will be shared with all of the county officials, state, and of course, we have two federal, we have Congressman Charlie Crist's office on Zoom, and then Congresswoman Cass's office on Zoom also. Anyone else? Questions?
Hello, my name is Dr. LaDonna Butler. Hello, and this is my home. With the University of South Florida, I am pleased to serve as the Associate Program Director at the Family Studies Center, mentioning much of the work that we look at with reckoning with race and infant and early childhood over the last year. Along with being the founder of the Well for Life, who deals directly with the behavioral health concerns, especially of Black and Brown folks in this community. So I sit in two spaces, but all serving one particular community, one that is most highest in need, as well as one of the most resilient communities that is being weathered over time. So that's my pre-statement. My next statement is there has been investment into study, specifically in infant and early childhood, a one-year study and looking at the impact of equity or specific equity focus in working with organizations that are touching our most vulnerable citizens. What do you imagine to be the next best step in investment in our citizens who are most vulnerable, which is 0 to 3? and touching the community, that overwhelming will touch them. And so I see you handing the mic over to my boss. This is our Tuesday 8 a.m. meeting, right? Live. So let's go.
You know, I mean, I think there's two sets of answers to that, and the set of answers that that I've become woke to in working with this group here is really everything that we do to take care of a grown-up man and a grown-up woman who's looking after children and just doing something for children birth to 3. You know, so often let's prop up the programs, let's take care for the babies, and that, you know, if I get money to put down, that's when I'm going to put it down. But we often overlook the strain and the stressors that their parents are experiencing. So I think whatever we're doing in any of these sectors that we're talking about today is going to improve overall health and well-being and find its way down to children. There's some things we can do directly for infants and toddlers and need to be doing that. And you all know about the child care crisis, and you know I don't know, it's been a few years since I reviewed the literature, but something like 90% of infant toddler centers were subpar. You know, and this is where our little ones are going to today when their moms and dads are going off and making minimum wage, trying to do the best they can to bring funding home. And we need to be doing everything we can to take care of them and to take care of and support. You know, we talk about the heroes in this COVID crisis. Child care centers never closed down. They never closed down. They took care of the kids, of first responders, of the medical personnel, and did so, you know, sometimes the loss of life for them. And they're the worst paid. There's the greatest burnout there. We don't take care of them. And they're doing God's work. They really are. So I certainly think any initiatives that can provide support. You said something, LaDonna, that made me think. You know, we focus so much on what is what's problematic. The resilience and the strength of the Black community. Also, that's another thing I've come away from this with. You know, we talk about the subpar equipment at Mercy Hospital, and you know the fact that the folks who worked at Mercy Hospital took care of the community. They were resilient. They helped people to stand up and get things done, and that continues in this community. And that the resilience end of things doesn't get talked about often enough. This is an extraordinary community, and people stand together. And so I think that I would. As biased as I might be, that, you know, if I had $100, I'd use the most discretionary money to take care of the babies and the toddlers, and I'll continue to say that to anybody that will listen. But I think anything that we do in any of these systems, you know, in terms of wealth and policing and housing and you know, affordability of where people are staying and the absence of turnover, that's going to make little children feel safe. That's going to make little children feel secure. And if we can pave the pathway for them to go into kindergarten in a school system where the teachers are all on board and aware and, you know, conscious about their implicit bias and able to embrace and welcome small Black boys and girls and help them to feel safe, then we're going to be sending them off in the right trajectory. So those are just like a few, you know, loose associations to your question. And I'm grateful to have this space. This is really not my time and my space. So I'm here as an ally. But really, this is for my colleagues who have been doing heavy lifting.
Last question and follow-up. Gypsy mentioned racial battle fatigue. I think she said battlefield fatigue, but I'm going to be specific and talk specifically about racial battle fatigue. We are noticing the rise and weathering of our provider base, no matter if they're working in city officials or if they are the ones taking care of our babies. We are hearing providers talk about how weathered they are. They are tired, stressed, and actively taking care of our public. We've noticed that reflective supervision as one of the strategies that is reducing the amount of stress that people are reporting within the workforce. What would you say, and I'm talking about everyone, what is our commitment to workforce, whether you are a city official, whether you're my friend over here doing the work with our law enforcement officers, working with their implicit bias, or if you're taking care of babies, what do you think our next right step is in taking care of our workforce who is taking care of the public? And that could be for anyone, not just Jamie, who knows about reflective supervision, but anyone who wants to talk about how we are taking care of ourselves as we are reckoning with race in this city.
Your question is timely considering I've been doing a lot of work with wellness. It's too often we take for granted mental health and also the well-being of the individual because we talk about below the neck, but we need to think about above the neck. Now, the NFL, the National Football League, they actually sponsored the Huddle for Change initiatives. And so we had those conversations with health equity. And in this regard, these things came to light, really think about how do you fund it. For example, Florida Blue would have acknowledged that they're going to invest $1 million there several into the space. But additionally, really thinking about HR training and thinking about taking time out because too often we think about sick days as only days when but you need to take time for you. So really reviewing the policies and taking those breaks and healthy breaks and marketing it appropriately relative to little strategies, affirmation, 20-minute walks. And so the simplest things help to rejuvenate, refresh. And so as you talked about the strain, it is real. And then we talk about healthy networks that can allow you to debrief, but also network that help to empower. And so in this construct of wellness, there are different branches of space of wealth, because when we think about wellness, we only think about one dimension, but it's a complex system. Or even go into the art museum, like really embracing the art, because culture helps to heal. Culture is fluid, but culture helps you to see why you keep fighting what you fight. So Terry, thank you for your artwork. So it helps us to reimagine and also appreciate our heritage, but also how we move forward. And so the complexity, perhaps really working with different mental health providers and making a clear marketing initiative to target wellness. But that's what we've been doing even at the University of South Florida. Many of our talks for the Enlightenment series, we really start targeting wellness because a healthy body requires a healthy mind. And they go hand in hand.
Anyone else? No one else have our.
Hi, Karen Neesman from USF. I'm just wondering when this report will actually be published.
Thank you, Karen. I'm actually going to speak to that in my closing thoughts and remarks, what our next steps look like. So appreciate your question. And I thank everyone for coming out. Thank you very much for being here, for your interest. And if you are touched by the outcomes that were reported in this study, all of our collective participation is very important. I want to thank this study team, Dr. Sears, and everyone who lent their intellectual capital, time, and expertise to this very important endeavor, and wanted to spend just a few minutes on our methodology and the anthology of this to date and our next steps, because we have been so very intentional about the way we've taken on this study. It is an exercise in truth and reconciliation, and it stems from a situation that will be familiar to all of you. You'll recall during our King celebration a few years back, our African-American community was quite dissatisfied with the way our city responded to gathering crowds. And there was a request to seat a committee to look at the way things happen in the city between the African-American community and those who sit in positions of power and decision-making. And it coincided, intersected quite divinely, I think, with other work we'd already been contemplating for quite some time, actually since 2014. One of the first things the mayor, Nikki Capehart, Kevin King, and myself sat down to talk about was exactly this type of documentation and truth about the disparity and dissonance experienced between Black people in our community and other people in our community. And so while we had the request to approach or to seat a committee to look at what happened that day and talk about quality of life for African Americans in our community and what can we do to ensure that things are different, we knew that we needed to be very strategic and focus on systems change that is bigger than any one incident or response, but really looks at the root causes and document frustration, take it beyond the narrative that people offer and ensure that everyone sits in a place of decision-making and power understands that this is a validated experience that dates back to the very foundings of our city and influences every day the reality of Black people who call this city home and can be seen in every outcome experience. We are in a very historic time in our city, regardless of the mayoral election that happens next week, which could result in a historic outcome. But the candidacy and the seriousness with which it's been taken is historic. And it's an important time to have also this conversation, because we all must remember that progress in our community is not determined, measured, or dictated in the number of firsts who are placed in positions, but how long it takes for integrated leadership and minority excellence to be normalized in every system. How long does it take for a second or a third or a fourth to follow? And progress in our city is not determined by the people who sit in this room. Just the presence of being in this room indicates some level of empowerment, understanding, desire to change, involvement, and it's important. But progress in our community is determined by everybody who calls it home, and we all know, based on the evidence that we saw today, evidence, not opinions, not perceptions, real experiences that happen as often today as they ever did. Progress is measured by when and how and with what vigor we change that, so that that story is no longer a part of St. Pete's story. And so our study concludes today with this report, but our work begins. Because as a city, those who sit in leadership, whether you are a city official or you're a state official or you're a school board official, every day we sit down and we decide what's important. We ask questions. Is our community safe? Is our community well? Is our community clean? And as a community, we are deciding to ask every day, is our community equitable? And we're deciding to do what it takes to ensure that answer is yes. And so what will happen now is the mayor will receive this study that's been commissioned. Our team will go back and reflect on the recommendations and come up with an action plan. We will share that with City Council with a request to codify it and make it a part of our memorialized and codified plan of what it takes to realize our vision in St. Pete. And then we'll go about the work of implementing it. But it's something that we will have to deal with every day. You'll see that the mayor's cabinet in its entirety is here. And that's because this is the work that defines our responsibility every day. And we are absolutely committed to it. And while it's our responsibility, it's our jobs, but it's also our commitment. We take it very seriously. And we meet your commitment where you are. So thank you for your interest. This report will be published online. It will be available. We encourage you to encourage everyone you know to read it, because it's so important to acknowledge this history and to own that it happened, so that we can ensure that it stops and it doesn't happen anymore for souls yet born. And we can do it, and we will do it, and we will be a city of opportunity where the sun shines on all who come to live, work, and play. We will absolutely be that city. So thank you for your excellent work. Thank you, city team and other officials for the excellence that you bring to our city. And thank you, everyone who is working to make this a better place. Have a great night.